Hello and welcome to the Divine Renovation Podcast, where we seek to help you take your parish from maintenance to mission. My name is Ron Huntley, and together with me today is Matt Vaughan from St. Benedict Parish, Director of Communications.
Thank you, Ron.
Welcome, Matt.
For having me here. Thank you.
And Mike Tanner, our own Divine Renovation Communication Specialist.
It's good to be here.
And our very special guest, Andrew Pepper, who is the chaplain of the Halifax Mooseheads Quebec Major Junior Hockey Team. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you. Great to be here.
It's great to have you here. We have a common passion. All four of us do. That we love sports, right? And we're all Canadians, so we love hockey. So for the rest of you around the world, that is ice hockey that we're talking about, not field hockey.
Right.
I was recently in the UK, and they say, is it real hockey or ice hockey? I said, ice hockey is real hockey.
Yeah, that is so not a good question.
I've actually played field hockey for 17 years and have played against people from all over the world. And you'll say, like, I play hockey, and they're like, same thing. They're like, yeah, but do you skate hockey or what do you? And so it's a legit thing worldwide. So
there you go. Terrific. Andrew, I'd love to hear from you. I know you work with Hockey Ministries International as a chaplain. And for our listeners who might not know what Hockey Ministries International is, why don't you share with us a little bit about who they are and what they do?
So Hockey Ministries International is a sports ministry organization. Started around the late 70s. And it's one of those things where we run chapel programs around the world. Don't have the stats right off of my head, unfortunately, but okay. It's one of those things where we have chaplains in the NHL, in the Quebec, and in the CHL, the AHL.
What's the CHL? What's the AHL?
CHL is the Canadian Hockey League. Sorry, the acronyms are a big thing for me. So Canadian Hockey League, which compromises there's three different leagues in it. So the WHL, which is the Western Hockey League, which is Manitoba, Western Canada, and some of the states. The Ontario Hockey League, which is just the province of Ontario, and then the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League, which compromises Quebec and the Atlantic provinces.
Love it.
So the AHL is the American Hockey League, which is the farm system for the NHL. We have it in the ECHL as well as NCAA. So we cover a variety of hockey leagues around the world. The North American ones are the ones I'm more familiar with.
Sure.
But it's one of those things. We run chapel programs with these in these leagues, and we also have Christian hockey camps in the summer, which go all over the world. My ministry leader, Bruce Smith, it's one of those things where it's when I look at his, you figure when the season's done, okay, he's good. He's going to have a calm summer, and it actually ends up being more wild because he goes, he's in his I believe in his early 60s. It's one of those things where he goes everywhere from Denver, Colorado, all the way over to northern Sweden. So
Come on. So Bruce is actually doing these hockey camps all over the world. What's the purpose of the hockey camp? To make amazing hockey players? What's the purpose?
The purpose is to be able to speak to the hockey community about faith in Jesus, and really it's a mission outreach. It's a para-ministry where we come into a world that is pretty much secular, and we're just there to minister and serve these people in Christ's name. And
amazing.
It's
What age groups come to these hockey camps and stuff?
I think you're looking at anywhere from I think it's about 8 till midget sort of thing.
Awesome.
Once guys are hitting the major junior circuit anyway, it's one of those things where they don't have they obviously their time is committed. So hockey camps aren't as big a thing for them anymore. Right. So yeah.
That's fantastic. I know that Joe DePenta, who goes to St. Benedict Parish, who was impacted by your ministry, by Hockey Ministries International when he was an NHL player. He just started a hockey camp for Hockey Ministries International in Cole Harbour last year, I think.
Yeah. It's actually been two years ago. Yeah.
Nice. So isn't that cool?
It is. It's absolutely amazing. Joey and I have actually known each other since high school. It's been amazing to see his journey of faith. It's one of those things. I don't know where his faith was in high school. My faith, part of my faith journey was, started in high school, but I don't know if I was necessarily committed. It's I come from an evangelical background. I guess would probably be it's a mixed background, but the evangelical has been more the center of it. But it's one of those things where when I was 14 or 15, I said a prayer, but I don't know if I knew what I was doing, but I don't know that if my faith seemed very rigid, and it was a little bit of. But anyway, Joey and I knew each other, so to see him, we kind of had seen him over the past few years, and didn't know where his faith was, and I think his faith has really blossomed over the past 3 or 4 years. But it's been great to see, and it's awesome to have that connection and just to see how God's been working in his life.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of think he's one of these best case scenarios for somebody with hockey and faith, right? Because he's somebody achieved the highest goal. He won the Stanley Cup. And now he's somebody who, after hockey, he's doing so much great work. You know, he's involved in parish. He's doing this hockey camp now. So I got to think he's like, I mean, he's older than I am, so I kind of have to look up to him, right? But he's somebody, you know, that other people should definitely look up to as well. It's like a great goal to have.
Well, and when you think about looking up to someone, you think of a lot of times, you know, our youth look at it and go, well, that guy's playing in the NHL or he's playing in the NBA or he's playing in the NFL. Faith probably has nothing to do with his life. I need to focus on this. And then for them to see like, oh, I could love Jesus and also win the Stanley Cup. That seems like best case scenario for me. So to have kids who actually see these role models at that level, to me is incredible. It's a great experience for them.
Really helps. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about, like, when did chaplaincy program enter into the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League, and what's Halifax's role been?
In the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League came here about the mid-90s. And so before that, it was the AHL. So Bruce Smith was actually, he was an AHL chaplain for the St. John Flames. And then when the AHL teams all of a sudden started moving out, the Quebec Major Junior League came in. And like I said, it was around the mid to late 90s. And the Quebec Major Junior League was not open to it for the longest time. Really, it wasn't until 2006. And it's ironically, I dated a girl at that time who, and you know, she kind of brought up that it's one of those things that you know, like she came from out west, and she's like, you know, like all the teams in the WHL have chaplains. All the teams, you know, or most of the teams. I think there was one team because she specifically said, "This is." I said, "This team is my favorite WHL team." She's like, "Yeah, they don't have a chaplaincy program." she was a Bible school girl. So anyway, but she had kind of said that the Q had been a hard sell, and it was in 2006. And ironically, that's when Bobby Smith took over as majority owner with Halifax Mooseheads, and Bobby has been instrumental in introducing the Quebec Major the chapel.
And for people
program.
who don't know Bobby Smith, tell us a little bit about who he is in the hockey world.
So Bobby Smith is another former Stanley Cup champion with the Montreal Canadiens. He won in 1986.
Best team ever, I might add.
I have to go.
Could get a little heated here.
Yeah, that's right.
But yeah, so Bobby's originally he was born in Nova Scotia but raised in Ottawa. I hope I'm getting his story correct. If you know, Bobby's a pretty approachable guy. So if you see him and you know you say, hey, I heard this from the
if
the
you
chaplain.
Get fired, we'll know why.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Bobby's also a very gracious guy, so that's one of those things I lean on.
Not a risk.
But Bobby, it's one of those things where he came, basically Stanley Cup champion, originally from Nova Scotia, born in North Sydney, I believe it is, moved to Ottawa, and then, but kind of got known as like the first, you know, I don't want to say the first, him and Mike McPhee were kind of the first Nova Scotians to really be at the center of the NHL, or, you know, be big players in the NHL, and Al McGuinness, they were kind of all in the same time. So anyway, it's one of those things where, Bobby, you know, he came to faith. I believe kind of at his time with the Canadiens, I believe Ryan Walter had a big impact on him. So so anyway, he became the.
Was Ryan Walter another player?
Yes, Ryan Walter is another player for the Montreal Canadiens. Right. I apologize. Sometimes I forget that people are listening around the world, so it's these names don't have the same ring as say Lionel Messi or Pele or any of that. So anyway, so yeah.
Beautiful.
But yeah, Bobby Smith became the majority owner of the Mooseheads in 2006. Bruce kind of, you know, hey, here's the time to knock on a door, and I'll see if that's, you know, see if it opens. And Bobby's like, yeah, let's give it a go. And so anyway, so
the first team.
We were the first team to have a hockey chaplain. Wow. Yeah.
First team. It's interesting. My son Christian plays in the Quebec League, and this used to be his jersey. I just got traded to the Moncton Wildcats over Christmas, and. But they didn't have a chaplaincy program. And, you know, my son growing up with a strong faith at St. Benedict Parish and in the youth groups and always really a big part of our life as a family, it was hard. You know, being 16 years old away from home and really your faith not being supported at all. Because being a hockey player at that level is like a full-time job, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I mean, between school and hockey, that's your life.
Yeah.
And so to not have any support on an area of your life that's so foundational important, it really shakes your world. It's tough. What are you seeing in terms of kids coming into, like these are 16-year-old kids, 17-year-old kids that are coming into the league. What are you seeing in terms of level of faith or lack thereof? And
Yeah, I mean, if you were to say, you know, I've been the chaplain with the team. This is my fifth season, so it's one of those things where I've seen it. You know, can run anywhere from, you know, I think starting out, I was getting, you know, 5. You know, usually the first chapel of the season, it can be, you know, most of the team can show up, but usually I'm getting anywhere from, you know, 3 to 4 guys out of chapel.
What is it, a chapel?
So basically what chapel is we host it usually after a practice. You know, it's after practice, which usually means it's around supper time. So we bring them food. So we have a meal, and then I just do a little talk for, you know, anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes, just where I mix stories of athletic stories, probably personal stories, and even stories from the professional world, stories of faith, and then we talk. You know, we usually go over a scripture verse, and then I try to apply that to their lives. And I usually, you know, kind of over the past couple of years, I try to because I didn't grow up playing hockey. It's one of those things where, in fact, I can't even skate. So it's fun. Well, yeah, it's a little side.
Secret's out now.
Yeah, well, yeah. I had a friend chirp me the other day. He said, you know, that people are like, oh, how long have you been chaplain of the Moose? It's 5 years. And my buddy's like, yeah, it's not bad for a guy who can't skate, you know? So yeah, a little side note, I took my son out to his skating lessons there on Sunday. And it's one of those things where I was there in my boots, because if I tried to help him skate while I'm on skates, it'd be who's helping who. So my son's 4 years old, and it's, I got a nice Mooseheads jacket, and I was like, you know what? It will look fairly pretentious if a guy who doesn't skate is sitting there with a Mooseheads jacket. So anyway, so I kind of, you know, wore a little bit more of a low-key jacket. But yeah, to get back to kind of the chapel, you know, kind of the way chapels go, I usually lately have been trying to relate stories from NHLers who are open Christians. So that would be guys like Mike Fisher, who just retired from the Nashville Predators, Laurie Boschman, who I've met once or twice before, and usually I'm in contact with them once or twice a year. You know, it just kind of helps them, like, even if they're like, well, yeah, that applies to track, which is what I ran, what I did as a sport. You know, that story applies to track. What about hockey? Well, here's this guy. You know, maybe he can relate to you a bit more. Yeah. So yeah, and usually, you know, kind of. Again, the height of chapel attendance would have probably been about 2 years ago, where I was getting somewhere between 15 and 20 guys. This year has been anywhere between 5 and 10 guys, which is still good. You know, it's funny because, you know, I met with Bobby over the Christmas break there, and it's just one of those things where, you know, Bobby's a competitive guy, and I know that there's some chapel programs where it's like you got 22 guys out. I was like, you know, how's it going? I'm like, oh, well, you know, attendance like 2 years ago was, you know, like this, and then this year it's dropped off a bit. And he's like, well, still, I mean, you know what? You got guys who aren't necessarily professing to be Christians or church kids, who are, you know, it's, you know, if you were to go to a high school, and you know, like 4 to 5 guys is basically 25% of the team. You know, if you were to go to a high school and ask if 25% of those kids are going to church, you wouldn't get that number. So yeah,
that's a good point.
I'm surprised by that number. Like, that seems much higher than I would have guessed, which is fantastic. I think that's great.
Yeah,
it's been amazing, and it's you know, coming in, and I've really grown through this. There was very much those points where, you know, like when things started, like, you know, first they were kind of shaky because it was a rebuild of the chapel program. So I was a new chaplain coming in, so I was kind of a bit of the, you know, it's a rebuild the same way that happens a lot in the Quebec Major Junior Leagues. You have guys move on, and so anyway, my second year, it's, you know, I started to get a little bit big-headed. I'm kind of confessing here. And all of a sudden, like, the Holy Spirit just kind of, you know, says to me, it's like, you know, that's me, right? And it has been absolutely amazing. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. So yeah, you gotta love those convictions. And so anyway, it's one of those things where it's been cool to see, and it's really defied my what I expected going in. Like, going in, I expected, it was one of those things that I figured the guys who were, you know, prodigies in the National Hockey League would kind of almost be like, would not want to talk to me. They'd be, you know, like, we don't want to talk to that guy. So it's one of those things where it was great to see, you know, it's one of those things for them to interact with you. You know, there's guys who it's, you know, the first player that went to interact with me actually was a guy who's an NHL prospect, and he kind of just kind of came up and said, you know, he's like, hey, I got to keep these guys anonymity just because, you know, we respect guys' faith journey. That is a journey, and some of them they want a private thing. But, you know, it was one of the NHL guys who came up to me, and the other thing I expected to be, okay, like, I expect you know, just culturally we have these perceptions of, you know, what people think of Christianity and religion and God, and so I figured, you know, the American players would probably be more open to it. Maritimes would probably be mixed. Quebec, I figured there wouldn't be open to it, and European, I didn't figure would be open to it.
Okay.
And I found that those stereotypes have just been brought down, that those guys are not even just willing to interact with me, but, they show up to chapel. They're, they find it interesting, that sort of thing there. So it's been great to see just the way God's work there. It's one of those things. I think what's encouraging for me, if you were to say, how many of these guys, are Christians. There was a point where my first 2 years where I would literally kind of have a bit of a Q&A session, because I'm going like, listen, at that point I was in my mid-30s. I'm like, I'm in my mid-30s. You guys are in your mid-teens to 20. I just want to make sure that I'm reaching you guys. And there's a couple of the guys like, so like, how many of you go to church? And like, wouldn't raise their hand. And they're like, one guy's like, I think I went Catholic. I don't know who's the ones that cross themselves. Right. and then it's one of those things where another guy was just like, I went to Sunday school as a kid. I think, is Lutheran a thing? Is that
right?
So
that's the level of just disconnection from church.
And actually it's funny because one of the players kind of came up to me at the start of the season, and he's like, listen, me and this other guy, like, we're not religious by any means, but we really like chapel. It really speaks to us, and we really find we can relate to it. So to me, that's amazing. I look at it as a ministry. I don't know if there'll ever be a point where you'll see all these guys come into faith. Like you'll see, what are they called when it's, I can't think of the word right now, but I don't think it'll be, it's one of those things where I'll be sitting there praying for guys as they're accepting Jesus in their life necessarily. But the way I see it is it's the first step for a lot of them. And I just trust the Holy Spirit that he'll work in a good way, and that he's working in their lives as we speak.
Well, Andrew, as you say that, I think to myself, just Joe DePenta's story.
Yeah.
Hockey Ministries International played a big role, and it was a teammate who he saw his character was unflappable, and his decisions were not consistent with the decisions of his teammates.
Yes.
In terms of how they spent their extracurricular activity, we'll say.
Yeah.
And this guy wouldn't budge. And Joe really, he looked up to him, but he couldn't understand him. It didn't make sense to him, because Joe says in his story, my parents went to church, I went to church, but this guy lived faith. There's a difference between knowing Jesus and just being able to go to church. And, when he talked about coming to St. Benedict, it really has reconnected him, because for him, he knew he was Catholic.
Yeah.
And he was connected with all these other Christians, which was helpful and supported his faith journey. But when he found a church that was familiar to him, that was alive in faith and bringing others to faith, he said changed everything. And so for us as local churches, so many churches see sport as the enemy.
Yeah.
The church would be full if it wasn't for hockey. The church would be full if it wasn't for soccer. Like, we consider these other options enemies, and I understand it.
Yeah.
Because before you couldn't play hockey on a Sunday morning.
Yeah.
But that's not our culture anymore. And so thankfully we have people like you working on the behind the scenes with these kids, and churches have to be great. So if they ever do come to a church, it won't be this horrible experience.
Absolutely. Well, it's one of those things. It's funny because about 3 or 4 years ago, we had a conference for the hockey chaplains, and there was a kind of an older lady, and it was kind of, I guess, finished off with a faith and family night. And so there was this lady kind of came up to us and said, I'm glad you guys are doing what you're doing, because I see the rinks are packed and the churches are empty, and it really disappoints me. And I remember I really appreciated this lady's heart. But at the same time, I'm thinking to myself, like, it's not hockey players and people who don't go to church. It's not their job for them to come to us. It's our job to come to them. And I'm going, to me, this is just a huge opportunity. I think it was about 6 months later, I ended up talking with this chaplain when the CIS champion.
What's CIS?
CIS is the Canadian university sport. Yeah,
right,
university sport.
Okay.
It was CIAU back in the day.
Right.
Had a few name changes. It might be U Sports now too. I don't know.
That's how their hashtag is on Twitter and that sort of thing there.
University. Okay.
But I was talking with a guy named Rod Elm, and it's one of those things where he'd been a chaplain for I think about 20 years. He worked for Athletes in Action, which is another minister organization. But what he had talked about was he had said that there's a point where he had these guys who came out to chapel, and when he was with the Saskatchewan Huskies with their hockey program, and it's one of those things where he's talking to one of the guys, and the guy was like, I really miss chapel, and he's like, well, Ron, his thought is just, his thought was, hey, why, when you go to church, like, you don't need chapel anymore. Church is kind of what replaces it. And they're like, but yeah, it's not the same. So it's one of those things. So it ended up being one of those things where they ended up meeting for chapels outside of, later on, they ended up meeting for chapels, just, it was like 5 or 10 of them. And so it's one of those things where I think, obviously we want corporate worship. Obviously we want the, the church on the hill, but we're in a post-Christian society. Amen. And we almost have to meet the same way the church did in the book of Acts,
100%.
which is in these in houses and in rinks and in locker rooms. I mean, for me, it was not so much locker rooms, but there's places in an arena. Yeah. One of those things, the past 2 years, I've been really blessed that the Mooseheads have got this new practice facility over in Dartmouth, and it's state of the art. It's basically like the NHL. Like, it's one of those things where now I'm talking in a media room where there's, I can play YouTube videos. But to me, when they were practicing at the Scotia Bank Center, it's one of those things where there's points where there's a conference room, the Voyager room, that's kind of down the hall. That's where we'd used to meet when that door was open. But the other times, it's one of those things where we just pulling back a curtain where they're storing their chairs and just set a few of them up. And so I'm sitting there with my video, like basically my iPad showing these videos, and got a little portable speaker. But to me, it's like, I feel very blessed with this practice facility. But to me, what I love, there is times where I'm just like, I miss the grit and the authenticity of what went on kind of in the bowels of an arena, right? Like, where you're sitting there and, you're wondering if a security guard's going to kick you out. I mean, that's, because they don't necessarily know there's a chapel program, right? They just see, like, just
what are they doing over there?
Exactly.
We've talked a little bit about some of the evangelical experiential tools that we have to bring people to the experience of Jesus. And then we talk about the idea that, once you've got them interested, whatever you bring them to, it has to match that.
Yeah.
And so if we're having this experience where you have young men sitting together, talking about their faith and being teammates in a community, and then they come into a church where there's no teammates and there's no community, and they're not feeling that, you walk away. Yeah. You don't hang out when that thing isn't the same. And I think it's so interesting that you talk about the idea of, but church isn't like chapel. And it's like, why not? Well, why are we not having that sense of community that brings us together when we come into the doors on Sunday?
Yeah. We feel that too when I'm just hearing that. It's so funny. It's so affirming for the whole Alpha to Connect groups thing that we talk about with at St. Benedict and at other Divine Renovation parishes, because people go through Alpha, they have this experience, they go, oh, this is what church is like, this is great. And if you just throw them back into a Sunday experience and it's not the same, and it can't be the same because it's not the same format, people are like, oh, there's a disappointment, or they're like, oh, I kind of like that. And I just had my Connect group last night. It was about, I think, 18 people. And it was that small church experience. It was exactly like what you said, going back to the early days of the church. Yeah. And that's what gave people life. And it's just really affirming that it's not like this idea that we made up and we're like, I think this works. It works 100%. We're hearing it in that story you told with that young guy saying, no, I want to have the chapel one of the same. I'm seeing lots of people, lots of young people too, who feel the exact same way. It's cool to hear it.
It's not one or the other. Yeah. And that's what we say. Like in our tradition as Roman Catholics, the Mass is the highest form of prayer. Like, it's so beautiful, but it doesn't make sense if you don't love Jesus and aren't filled with the Holy Spirit. And so it's a terrible assumption to think that that's the first entry point for somebody coming out of a chapel program and doesn't know if he's Catholic or Lutheran. Like, I mean, Mass isn't it. Like, just this morning, I go to a men's leadership gym, and the gym stands for God, you, and me. Yeah. And, new guy there. He's a professional football player. Yeah. And it's just a bunch of guys together, giving a talk, having small group discussion, singing praise songs, and praying together. And that probably feels a lot more like a chapel program or than it would a Sunday experience. And so it's not one or the other, it's one and the other. And I think if as leaders in the church we can start to innovate and start to think of things, particularly, like I say, in our Catholic tradition, outside of the Holy Mass, it doesn't take away from the Mass, but there needs to be other entry points so we can bring people along.
Absolutely. I think one of those things that it really comes, the church we have to be self-aware. We have to be aware that we're now in a post-Christian society. And I look at, I'll give you a bit of my story. So, it's one of those things where, again, said a prayer when I was 15. I think this is where I really got this concept of being saved by grace and not works. Okay. But I walked away from my faith, got to university, and all of a sudden my Christian friends were, we had kind of separated, and it's one of those things that I was a partier and that sort of thing there. I love going down, living the university lifestyle. And I mean, the first time basically it was a conversation. I worked at Toys R Us at the time, and it's one of those things where there was Christians who were very like pushy with their faith, and I'd come in hungover, and they'd be like, and I'd be singing Metallica. I remember one guy in particular saying, Metallica's of the devil, and I'm just kind of like, and I wasn't a Satanist or anything, but it was like rebellious, kind of threw the devil horns at him. In a way, there was basically basically a gesture of like, yeah, you're not going to tell me what to do, and you're not going to sit there self-righteously over me. And it was a friend who basically was, again, open about his faith. He never one of those things pretended to be someone else, but it was a conversation with him on my last day at Toys R Us, and he encouraged me to go to a church out in Cole Harbour called Hillside Wesleyan. And it's one of those things where I remember going there, and it was funny. I meant to go. It was one point like, I'm going to be there this week, Nathan. I ended up going out and getting drunk and not making it. And eventually, they hit a point where it's like I went out and I was like, okay, I'm sober enough to go to church. And so I ended up basically going, and I drove over, and it's one of those things where I was, hungover and walked in. And I remember just kind of walking in, and I'd gone to an independent Baptist church in my teen years. And all of a sudden I saw people with their hands in the air, and there's a lot of the weird nuances that we don't always realize as Christians. And so it's one of those things where I remember thinking like, oh, here we go again. And it was one of those things, God, I think, just used, there was one person, one familiar face there when I went to this church, because even my friend who invited me out, he was playing in the worship band. And so I just sat beside him. But yeah, I remember how just weird, like not even so much weird, it's like, I know what I'm getting into, and this still seems weird. And I think it's one of those things where we need to make sure, we want people to worship the way they want to worship. But at the same time, we have to be aware that, that corporate gathering is weird for people who don't know the tradition. Yeah,
it's true.
Yeah.
How do the players, how do they approach you? Like, what kinds of things have you seen? Like, are they timid? Like, do they reach out to you when they're down, when they're going through a slump? Like, what happens? Talk to us a little bit about the ins and outs of what you do and how you're present to people.
I feel that's one of those. It can be a very nuanced approach that I'm still trying to figure out, because hockey players, there still, I think, is this mentality in hockey about you suck it up, you deal with it, you don't be emotionally available. I'm glad to see that kind of, it seems to be, Mike Babcock, Let's Talk. He's very open about, helping Austin Matthews. Like, to me, it was amazing to hear him recognize that when Austin Matthews was hurt, that it's like he needs to have community when he's hurt. He can't, if he gets isolated, that's where your mind just starts racing and automatically goes to the negative. But I find it's one of those things where you have to be nuanced. You don't want to be pushy on the players, because then they won't want to talk to you, and it'll create a lot of tension. At the same time, to me, my approach is to be available. It's one of those things where I do a lot of times have to approach players, but you have to be very aware of social cues. So it's one of those things where there's guys who love talking to you. There's guys who, will tell me, it's always a pleasure talking to you. I kind of was talking to you guys a little bit before the podcast about, there was a guy who reached out to me about chapel. And my last chapel was I talked on mental health, and I talked about anxiety, and I was open about actually some of my anxiety issues and kind of the, what I'd gone through. And that authenticity, I think, allowed him to go like, listen, you know what? That really spoke to me. And to me, it was about, it wasn't just about that long-term anxiety. It's also even about that short-term anxiety. And I preached from Philippians 4, 6, and 7, and just this whole fact of knowing, like, listen, God loves you. He has a plan for your life. We don't always understand it. So we go through these trials and we don't know what's going on. But it's one of those things where, you should have peace in that. And actually, I finished this off sharing Laurie Boschman's story about how he had anxiety in his early career when he wasn't a Christian. And it was a player named Ron Ellis who basically, you talk about Joey's teammate. Basically, Ron Ellis was Bosch's teammate. And it's one of those things where he just saw this way that he lived out his life and this calm. And it was one of those things where Ron, when he was approached, just said, listen, I had that because of Jesus. And so so it wasn't long after that Laurie went to chapel and was like, I want what Ron has there. And so
Isn't
anyway,
that interesting?
yeah. So yeah, it's and to me, so for me, I try to kind of approach those things that relate to them. I do try to be open with players. There's players who, they might, after a loss, I pretty much won't go near the locker room unless I really have to. It's one of those things where it's one of those things where, guys just don't want to talk to you. It can create tension. The coaches don't want to see you. It's just one of those things where you got to like, listen, I'll give those guys their space. There is the odd time where I have to kind of break that rule, but anyway, but it's one of those things where I just, usually kind of after the game, I'll just come up and talk to them. And yeah, just have a conversation with them. I think the biggest thing for me is that these guys, hockey is their life. And I tried to get away from that. Originally, it was one of those things where I felt like I have to be the perfect fan who knows all their stats and this sort of thing there. And I think it's one of those things like, listen, they have enough fans, they have the media on them. They have enough fans who know their stats, who know them as hockey players. To me, it's, how's your family? How's your billet parents? How's school going? and to me, I love hearing those stories. There's guys where it's, one of the things that I do for my leisure time is I go hunting, and it's one of those things where there's points where players, when you can talk about hunting, it's amazing because it's just it can be this really great conversation, and it opens them up, and that way they, when they do have something going on, they're more likely to reach out to you. And that's, again, I just try to be available to the guys. That's kind of what I think the key is just this being available, not being pushy. To me, it's, my thought is, listen, at chapel, you're going to hear about Jesus. If you're not at chapel, unless you want to bring it up, this is just you control the conversation. So, yeah.
It's interesting. You said something that, these players, hockey is their life. And I would say, I'm not so sure about that, because that's the culture.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be your life. Here's the truth. It's actually not. There might be 2 or 3 players on any team, and I'm talking professional hockey as well, where that's the truth. It's not the truth.
Yeah.
But that's the culture that hockey tries to create. And that's why, you talk about don't go near the dressing room after a loss. Well, do you know what? That is just a facade that they create as part of hockey culture. Because you're not supposed to be happy. You're not supposed to smile. You're supposed to be down on yourself. It's the culture that they build right into that sport.
Yeah.
And it's really not helpful.
No,
and it's not healthy. It's not real. And I don't think it's helpful for these athletes, because if you can't handle loss, you're going to have to grow up sooner or later.
Absolutely.
And so it's interesting, the different cultures that take place in sport, and we try to make sport a false idol. Absolutely. It's a false god. Yeah. And people know that in their hearts.
Yep.
And so, I hope there's people listening that play sports. It's like, put it in perspective, people. It's a game.
Yeah.
And it's a game that you might be able to make a living at and that you're probably really excited about. But there's more to life than hockey. There's more to life than sports. And we all know that. And I think it's really refreshing when you get somebody like a Mike Babcock, who's now the coach of the Toronto Maple Leafs, who used to coach Team Canada at different points. But I remember, to your point, with Bell Canada, or Bell Let's Talk, it's a whole national program focused on talking about mental illness. And he was asked one time, or he brought in a psychologist to talk about mental health, and the media were really surprised. Why would you do that? These are the best athletes in Canada.
Yeah.
Why would you do that? He said, well, do the math. If 1 in 4 people have struggled with mental illness, I have 5 people on my team that are dealing with this. And if I want to win championships, then people have to be happy and healthy.
Yeah.
And don't you think that spirituality is a part of some people's lives? And if it is, wouldn't you want to address it?
Absolutely. Well, and actually, that's one of those things that I approached in this talk, is that the Canadian Mental Health Commission talks about spirituality being an important part of overall wellness. So it does, add that component in there, which in this day and age is a good thing, because a lot of people, don't want to hear that. We have a more secular society, and spirituality can be a difficult subject to approach. It's funny you talked about the fact that these guys make it their lives, and I try to enforce, and I'm not trying to be discouraging to them, but the reality is, I usually tell them what the stats are of a player in the Quebec Major Junior Hockey would make in the NHL, and I believe it's either 3 to 5% chance, if you play in the Quebec Major Junior League, that you'll play in the NHL. And then in the NHL, the average career only lasts 5.5 years. 5.5 years is a very short period of time to dedicate your life to. I know for these guys, they're anywhere between 16 and 20 years old, and it might seem like a long time, but the reality is that is a very short period of time. So if you start when you're 20 and your career ends at 25, they're not all going to be Jaromir Jagr. They're not all even going to be like a Sidney Crosby, who's going to have a 10 or 15 year career. It's one of those things that they need to know, that they have that they are worth so much more than their ability to play hockey. I think one day I actually referred to it as their ability to shoot vulcanized rubber at a big piece of mesh. So when you look at it that way, it's pretty, it's pretty petty. It's not the biggest.
Well, that idea of connecting our identity, our soul identity to sport is so interesting to me. I didn't play hockey. About 10 years ago, I actually started skating, and now I play in a rec beginner hockey league. Yep. So there's still hope for you. Awesome. But I did play high school football, and blew my knee out before college, but had a high school teammate who went on to have a highly successful, very surprising football career. Yeah. 3 years in the NFL, and then a lengthy record-setting career as an offensive lineman in the CFL. Yeah. He ended up playing football for 15 years professionally, and a couple years ago retired. And I had talked with him quite a bit over the years, and we had never once talked about faith. Everything was football. And I'd followed him on Twitter, and that's where we kind of talked about stuff. That's where you and I actually sort of met, and it was all about football. And he retired 2 or 3 years ago. And the first thing, he knew that I was a stay-at-home dad with my kids, and he had twin boys. And the first thing he said is like, I don't know what to do now. Like I have no idea what to do now. And about 6 months ago, his feed now alternates between, here's who got signed by that team, and here's his teammate, and Jesus.
Wow.
And I'm seeing such a positive shift in his online, and I've chatted with him a little bit, but that identity, you end the point where you're like his career as a professional football player was supposed to last 1.5 years.
Yeah.
That's how long your career is supposed to be. And you talk about people who are, what do they love? There's a local restaurateur, Cory Urquhart. Cory was a second-round draft pick. Went on to have a brief AHL career and then an okay overseas career. And then all of a sudden realized, I don't love hockey anymore. And I think I loved hockey because I was so good at it.
Yeah.
But I don't love it anymore. And then he had to find something new. And, for him, it was opening this restaurant that's this really healthy restaurant that, helps build this community. But finding something, because sports doesn't last forever, and what are you going to do when it ends?
Well, any sport, you're right. But those high contact sports, they're violent. Hockey's violent. But here's the thing, too. If the average career is 5.5 years, they probably started when they were 5.
Absolutely.
Like my son started playing hockey when he was 5. He's 20 now. So he's been at it 15 years.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a long time. And then if they go on to play in the NHL or professional hockey at one level or another, they've actually been at it a long time. Most people don't start working when they're 5, but hockey players do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think it's one of those things too. I mean, now hockey, it's not one of those things, 30 or 40 years ago, it's one of those things, you played hockey in the winter to pass the time, you played baseball in the summer to pass the time. And now it's one of those things where it's like, you got to go in this hockey spring league, and there's all these different things that basically build your personality around this one game. And again, and there's parents, so many, I mean, even as I become a dad, it's been very hard for me. I've realized it could be easy for me to try to live vicariously through my son Max, especially my son or my daughter Suri. And it's one of those things where it's like, I don't want my son to say, I don't love my dad and I hate hockey, because both of that was something I didn't like in my life. And to me, it's one of those things where, I've just realized that it's like, if my son, if he enjoys hockey, hey, I'm willing to commit whatever it takes. But the day that he goes, listen, hockey's not my thing, cool, bud. That's all good.
Right.
So yeah, and that's it. So
because parents can take it pretty serious, any sport, right? Or even dance or music.
Absolutely.
And so how do we love our kids and not project on them? And that's a tough balance. I mean, it's tricky for people. I've seen people go off the deep. I'd always say, I remember you have Barrett Decisions jersey on. I know his dad, and Christian played with him, and it was a wonderful. Christian loved Dean, Barrett's dad, as a coach. Absolutely loved him. And I remember the first parent meeting he had with the parents, because he played in the NHL and played professional hockey, and he said, all right, guys, I know I've forgotten more about hockey than you guys will ever know. He's talking to the parents. He said, so leave the coaching to me, would you? Don't be coaching them in the car. Don't be coaching them at home, and don't be coaching them from the bleachers. I'm the coach, not you. And then he said, 3 things you can tell your kids: work hard, have fun, and don't rip the jersey.
My son just started playing this year, and it's been a balance for us. My son is having his first communion this year. Hockey practice is Sunday morning, and so we've had to say, like, bud, we're not going to practice today because we're headed off to church. And some days we do hockey and we don't do church. But it's been a hard balance for us. But we've really tried to. One of the things that I love about it is that we've been able to have him enjoy both those things. He loves the days that we go to church, and he enjoys that, and he's excited about it. And I think that, it doesn't have to be either or. You can involve it in their life rather than saying, like, all right, you got to make a choice right now, Jesus or Gretzky. Like, which one of those two things you want to do?
Well, it's interesting you say that, Mike, because we Christians always played in the top teams whole life, soccer and hockey, and then eventually you had to choose. But I remember one particular year I was coaching soccer, and one of the players' dads just was nominated the Adam AAA coach, so he got the role, and that's a big deal, right? When you're in hockey, and so he approached me at the soccer field one day, and he said, "Hey, Ron, don't know if you heard or not, but I've been given the AAA team." I knew where he's going, and I said, "Oh yeah, that's great, congratulations." And he said, "There's a chance that Christian might be able to make that team." I'm thinking, I know, but anyway, okay, cool, yeah. Well, our home games are on Sunday. Or our away games or home games are on Sundays. I'm like, hey, that's great.
Yeah.
And so he's waiting for me to bite, and I wasn't biting.
Yeah.
And he said, well, I'm bringing it up because I need to know where your commitment lies. I said, oh, are you asking me whether or not hockey's more important than Jesus? Is that what you're asking? And boy, put that out there, because that's exactly what he's asking.
What he's asking.
Yeah. And he said, oh, well, I just need to know where your priorities are. And I said, Kevin, here's the deal, bud.
Yeah.
If I can't teach my kids that Jesus is the most important thing in their life now, he sure won't be the most important thing in their life later. And so Jesus will always trump hockey, just so you know. But I'm Catholic, and there's church on Saturday nights and 2 or 3 times on Sundays. If I can't get to church on the weekend, that's not hockey's fault. Yeah. That's my priorities' fault. Yeah. And so we managed to get to church wherever we were, whenever we were. And because as parents, honestly, if you think hockey is going to be the gospel that you want your kids to learn, they're going to be miserably underprepared for life.
Absolutely.
We have to find ways to connect them to Christ if you think Christ matters.
How do you find both, a lot of these kids, these young men are away from home. The vast majority are not at home. How do you have any communication with parents or with billet parents in terms of what they expect from you as a chaplain or how the chaplaincy program works?
It's been one of those things where I went to the billet dinner this year, so it's the second year we had it. So there's points where parents have reached out to me on Twitter. There's points where I guess I connect with billet parents. Yeah, I guess connect with them on Twitter. There has been points where I've got to meet them, and so I know some of the billet parents. But it's one of those things where, again, I just try to be available with that. And it's the team gets an email, for a schedule each month. So I'm on there. In fact, it's one of those things where one of the chapel guys one day said, he's like, oh yeah, my billet mom knows you. Yeah, apparently you used to go to high school with her sister or something like that. I'm like, okay. So anyway, it's one of those things.
Not a great connection.
I've changed.
Exactly. It was all good. It's pretty funny, but anyway, but it's one of those things where they're aware that the team has a chaplain. But yeah, I think again, it just comes to being more available. I certainly don't want to ever come across as I'm pushing anything on anyone, because the biggest thing for me is I know what it's like to have something pushed on you, especially Christianity, and it's one of those things where it's not pleasant, and it doesn't make it more appealing for people. It's one of those things that when we're pushing religion on people, we're trying to push our worldview on them. We're not trying to introduce them to the Holy Spirit. Let's face it. It's one of those things that we need to trust the whole, be open about our faith, but trust that the Holy Spirit will do His thing.
I love it. Yeah. We get some, every summer is the draft. It's always an exciting time if you have kids. Like we just finished the Canada Games here in Canada, which is like 15-year-old hockey players playing the best in the country. And for this year, this is their draft year. Yeah. And some of those kids will be getting drafted to teams like Moncton that or Halifax that have chaplaincy programs. There's a shout out to Bill Parks, who's the chaplain at Moncton works with my son. But what advice would you have to families and kids who might be listening, who might be getting drafted to a team that does have a chaplaincy program? How would they connect? What would you say to them?
My biggest thing that I always, and it's what I start the year off with the Mooseheads, give it a shot. If you don't like it, the worst thing you get is you get a free burrito out of it. You know what I mean? So it's one of those things. Give it a shot, because the reality for parents, this is a hard thing for those kids. It's one of those things where a lot of them are away from home for the first time. It's one of those things where, growing, being 16 to 20 years old, as hard as it is, all of a sudden you get the media on you. Especially look at a city like Halifax, where the Mooseheads are very central. It's one of those things that, the stuff that they go through, I'd find hard as a guy who's almost 40, let alone when you're 15 years old and you're still dealing with those teenage insecurities and trying to figure yourself out. So I would say, for the parents, don't worry about, don't think that, when it comes to chaplains, we vet them well. So it's one of those things that they're going to be available for your kids. They're not trying to push anything. They're there to love your kids. They're there as part of, for me, I'm part of a support team. That's what I'm part of. I'm that spiritual support. And for the kids, I'd say just give chapel a shot. And for parents, don't be afraid to reach out, to reach out to the team and to the team chaplain and just say, there was a point where I had a parent who just, they added me on Twitter. I was at a game and they're basically like, can you go see my son? Because he's going through a hard time.
And that often happens.
Yes, and I actually appreciated that forward attitude, because so often it's as a player, I'm like, I don't know if we've even had a conversation. Like, he seems like a pretty private guy, and all of a sudden, so anyway, so it's just don't be afraid to reach out. If these parents would have contacts within the team. If you think a chaplain would be a good thing and a good perspective.
In fairness, some of these kids too, they do come from homes where they were going to church growing up, so it's not something that's completely foreign to them. Yet they may have drifted, and for parents, it's a great way to reconnect. What about those what about those owners and that have teams that don't have chaplaincy programs yet? What would you say to them?
It's one of those things that we're seeing more and more people who wouldn't confess to be Christians are seeing the benefit of a chapel program. One of the guys who's been very open about it is a guy named Barry Trotz, who was the coach for the Nashville Predators. Now he's with the New York Islanders. But he talked at our HMI, our All-Star breakfast there a few years back, and he was really just talking about Mike Fisher. And he talked about how it's Mike Fisher's the sort of guy. There seems to be this stereotype that as a Christian hockey player, you can't be gritty. And it's funny, which I find is
tell that to him when he's punching you in the face.
Well, that's it. And it's funny because and this is one of those things. Lord Boschman, that's part of his story, is that he basically was being criticized after he became a Christian. He was being criticized for his play. They said he's gotten soft, and Harold Ballard, the owner at the time, basically said he's gotten soft and he's found religion, and we think that's a part. And I mean, even went on to send him to a psychiatrist to make sure that he hadn't been brainwashed. And it's one of those things where one day I kind of approached Bobby Smith about that, and Bobby's like, "Listen, Laurie Boschman was one of the hardest players I played with." Turns out that the reason Laurie wasn't playing full tilt at that time is that he had mononucleosis and a blood infection. Right. And so it's one of those things where,
thinking a psychiatrist's not going to be able to help with that.
No, exactly. That's exactly it. But back to Barry Trotz, he kind of, I love this word what he said about Mike Fisher, and as far as that grittiness, is he said Mike Fisher's the sort of guy who would knock your block off on Saturday night and be praying for you Sunday morning. So it's one of those things where, to me, that's just such a good testimony to Mike, who has probably been the most open Christian player in the NHL over the past, I'd say, 15 or 20 years.
Well, I've seen more and more, like I say, we originally connected through Twitter, and I actually think we connected through the hockey side first, maybe through the Mooseheads, and then sort of connected that way. And I'm actually seeing more and more, and part of it is because I'm following you and I'm seeing these things, but I'm seeing more and more articles from players and people coming out and actually talking about it and being more open about it. And I'm so excited to see players actually sharing, like, this is a huge part of my life. This is the identity that is going to be here when I am no longer wearing this jersey. Yeah. When I'm in my community, and when I'm in my church, and when I'm raising my children, and having people be able to see that as a positive experience. It doesn't have to be. You don't have to put your faith aside to go be a hockey player. Yeah. In fact, you probably should not, because in those moments when, like I say, I have not played beyond the high school level and provincial athletics level, but there were moments where they were hard. And at that time, I wasn't religious. And that time I had, coaches in my life that were very supportive. But I remember you were talking about after a loss. And a moment that has always struck by me was we lost a provincial championship in my grade 12 year that we were very much supposed to win. Yeah. And supposed to. Everyone says, well, you're not supposed to. No. We were supposed to. And we lost. And, you've got a bunch of 17-year-old kids crying. We're all turning around, head down, crying. Yeah. And we had a coach who has passed away since, who has a pretty incredible life. And he walked over to every kid and just tilted their head up and was like, you can cry all you want, but there's no reason for you to look down. And that's a hard thing for athletes to connect to, is the idea of, like, I can be upset. A couple years ago, there was a world junior player who, I believe it was Sweden, they won the silver medal. When they gave him the medal, he tossed it into the crowd. Oh, yeah. And he got such, a backlash for these things. And, you have to understand, he's a kid, absolutely, who just lost what he probably considers to be the most important moment of his life. Yeah. And so if we can have something that they can lean back on, where a kid who has that moment goes, what do I have that's lifting me up? that's what we can do with it.
Absolutely.
As we wrap up, Andrew, thanks so much. It's been so fun to kind of open this up. You know, sport and faith is something that's so important to us because we all love sport. Is there anything that any closing message that you'd have for people that are listening?
I think the biggest thing for me is I think for athletes who would be listening, don't build your personality around your athletic achievements. You know, Jesus, you know, that's one of those things I really try to enforce with these guys is that your value isn't placed on the game. What it is placed on is the fact that Jesus died for you on the cross and he loves you and he has a plan for your life. 3 or 4 years ago was one of those things, kind of, you know, one of my first couple of years, I really pushed Jeremiah 29:11 a lot. And I usually give the context of that. It's like Jeremiah is telling this to these people as they're in a bad spot. As Israel's basically been conquered, everything looks like, you know, they basically like, we've ticked God off, he's abandoned us, and God's coming back and saying, no, I haven't. You know, I have a good plan for you, and it's a plan for hope. And so for me with players, it's easy to, you know, to me, it's one of those things. It's easy to be, you know, even for Christian athletes to be, you know, praise God during those great moments. I actually, a couple chapels ago, I talked about, you know, we kind of did something around the Super Bowl, and I talked about the story of the Philadelphia Eagles and the fact that God was working in an amazing way in their locker room. And that actually didn't stand out to me as much as a player named Brandon Cooks, who had played for the Patriots and had actually been knocked out in the first quarter by a headshot. And it's one of those things where, you know, he tweeted after the game, he said, you know, I don't know what's going on, God, but I trust in your plan. Something to that effect. And it's one of those things that, to me, when these guys, when they're down, when they're out, and when, you know, when it feels like, you know what, you know, oh my goodness, this is it. I've built my life around this, all around this, and now I'm a failure. It's like, no, you're not. God has a plan for your life, and this is part of it. And so, yeah, just know that, and walk with your head high, walk with your head high, and walk with confidence, knowing that God loves you and that He has a plan for your life.
Love it. Thank you so much. If people wanted to get in touch with you, if they want to connect with you, what's the best way to do that?
Twitter, Andrew capital R Pepper. That's my Twitter handle. And email andrewpepper9@gmail.com. Feel free to reach out to me. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks for what you do. Thanks for inspiring us today and our listeners. I really appreciate your ministry. To your point, this is a post-secular culture. Let's not wait for people to come to us. Let's find ways to go to them. So I appreciate your courage and everything you do to be missional and to build our church. May God continue to bless you. Thank you for listening today. I hope this has been a blessing to you. If you or anyone you know is an athlete and plays sports, Jesus is a big part of their ongoing success and life after sports. God bless you and thank you.